Look what you did.
Well, you miser. If we had one of those new Westinghouse frost-free refrigerator-freezer combinations they're just bringing out, I'd never have to defrost it.
Well, we'll just settle this thing right now.
Where are you going?
Come on, you'll see.
She made America laugh as Ethel Mertz on I Love Hers. But behind the cameras, Vivian Vance was quietly seething. Her dislike for co-star William Frawley wasn't just a rumor. It was a cold, hard reality that poisoned the most famous set in television history.
You know, you said that a good professional have a cost so much because you pay for what you get. But actually, we pay for what you get, what's left there. And I said, how much did they take off of you? And she said, $2,000.
Why did she truly despise the man millions thought was her perfect comedic partner? The answer lies in a toxic mix of vanity, cruel insults, and a generational clash that turned their fictional marriage into a real-life war. The tension and explosion. Why is the air on stage 24 at Desilu Studios often thick enough to choke a horse? You need to look at the two radically different worlds that birthed Fred and Ethel Mertz. Honestly, William Frawley and Vivian Vance didn't just come from different towns. They came from different centuries of how to behave in public. Frawley was born way back in 1887, a time when the American stage was a rough, tumble, and let's be real, often drunken affair. He was a product of the old-school vaudeville circuit, a brutal lifestyle where you lived out of a suitcase and played to rowdy crowds who'd toss a turnip at your head if a joke landed flat. Frawley learned early on that surviving show business required a thick skin, a loud voice, and a total lack of warm and fuzzies. By the time TV even existed, he had already popped up in over 100 films, usually playing the cynical everyman with a permanent scowl. To him, acting was a job, nothing more. You show up, say the lines, and hit the racetrack. Then you have Vivian Vance, born in 1909, who represented the new school of highbrow performance. She was 22 years younger than Frawley and had fought tooth and nail to be seen as a sophisticated Broadway actress. For Vance, acting was an art form that required emotional vulnerability and a certain level of grace. She was also a woman who took massive pride in her looks. She was actually a natural beauty, something she felt the industry constantly overlooked. When Desi Arnaz scouted her to play Ethel, she was at a total crossroads. She wanted to be a leading lady, but instead, she was being asked to play the frumpy neighbor to the most gorgeous woman on television. To pull off Ethel, Vance had to wear clothes that were intentionally 2 sizes too small, dowdy floral prints, and enough padding to ruin her silhouette. She was already sacrificing her vanity for the paycheck, so when she finally laid eyes on her on-screen husband, the sight of William Frawley felt like a slap in the face. The legendary explosion happened during the very first week of rehearsals for the pilot. Vance, likely feeling insecure about her age and where her career was headed, let slip a comment that would haunt her for decades. She turned to Desi Arnaz and complained, loudly, that nobody would ever believe she was married to that old man. She didn't whisper it. She didn't save it for a private lunch. She said it right within earshot of Frawley, a man whose ego was as seasoned as his resume. In that one moment, the Mertz marriage was forged in iron. Frawley, who already rolled his eyes at theatrical types from New York, decided right then that Vance was a prima donna who needed to be knocked down a peg. He didn't see a colleague anymore, he saw a target. He had a biting, sharp wit honed in the trenches of vaudeville, and he started using it to dismantle Vance's confidence whenever he got the chance. The tension only got worse because they worked totally differently. Vance was a perfectionist who dealt with serious clinical anxiety. Today, we'd call them panic attacks. She needed a supportive, safe environment to find her funny. Frawley, on the other hand, was a one-take wonder with zero patience for rehearsals or finding the character. He'd often show up with his lines barely memorized, just leaning on his natural grumpiness to get through the day. When Vance would get frustrated or ask for another take to nail a specific beat, Frawley would just mock her. He'd call her the girl who couldn't act, or make snide remarks about her Broadway airs. He realized he could rattle her just by leaning into the old man persona she hated so much, acting slower or more cantankerous just to watch her turn red. What the public didn't see was that this wasn't just a simple personality clash. It was a total breakdown of human values. Vance wanted respect. Frawley wanted to grab his check and be left alone. Because the show was filmed in front of a live audience, the pressure was sky high. Every time those cameras rolled, they had to fake being a couple that had spent 20 years in a tiny apartment together. They had to touch, they had to bicker playfully, and they had to sell the love underneath the nagging. But the second that red on-air light went dark, the mask fell off. They'd retreat to opposite corners of the stage, sometimes refusing to even look at each other for the rest of the night. Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball weren't blind to it. Desi had taken a huge gamble on Frawley, even putting a sobriety clause in his contract. If Bill missed a day of work because he was hitting the bottle, he was gone. Frawley kept his end of the bargain. He stayed sober on the clock, but being sober didn't make him any nicer. If anything, the lack of his usual scotch made him even more irritable. He took his frustrations out on Vance because she was an easy mark. He knew she was sensitive about her weight and her age, so he made those the punchlines of his jokes. He'd comment on how she looked in those Ethel costumes or suggest the writers give her more scenes where she was eating. It was cruel, calculated psychological warfare meant to keep her off balance. As the show turned into a global phenomenon, they both realized they were trapped in a golden cage. They were becoming some of the most famous people on the planet. But that fame was glued to someone they absolutely loathed. The writers, seeing that the genuine bite between Fred and Ethel was a hit, started writing even sharper insults for them. The audience thought it was brilliant comedy, but for Vivian Vance, it was often a living nightmare. She'd be in her dressing room in tears, wondering how she'd ended up tied to a man who loved making her miserable. It was a massive professional win, but a personal disaster, and as the seasons rolled on, the cracks in their relationship started to threaten the whole show. While their off-screen battles were reaching a fever pitch, they were about to discover that their mutual hatred was actually the secret ingredient that made them the most relatable couple in America. The art of the hateful hug. It is one of the great ironies of Hollywood history. The more Vivian and Bill loathed each other, the more the American public fell in love with them. By the second and third seasons, the writers weren't just guessing that there was tension. They were practically mining it for gold. They realized that when Ethel gave Fred that iconic narrow-eyed glare, Vivian Vance wasn't just acting annoyed, she was genuinely wondering if she could get away with physical assault. This raw, unfiltered irritation gave the Mertzes a grit that the Ricardos lacked. While Lucy and Desi were the glamorous, musical, high-energy heart of the show, Fred and Ethel were the reality check. They were the couple that had been married so long they communicated entirely in eye rolls and heavy sighs, and audiences found it incredibly refreshing. But for Vivian, this relatability came at a steep psychological price. Imagine having to show up to work every day and be intimate with someone who makes your skin crawl. There were scenes where Ethel had to sit on Fred's lap, or they had to share a bed in those classic 50s twin set arrangements. For Vance, these moments were skin-crawling. She felt that every time she had to play the happy wife, she was betraying her own dignity. Frawley, being the seasoned pro, and world-class instigator that he was, leaned into this discomfort. He knew exactly how to stand just a little too close or deliver a line with a puff of stale cigar breath just to see her flinch. He weaponized his own hygiene and his grumpy persona to keep her in a state of constant, low-grade agitation. The Mertz dynamic became a masterclass in what actors call playing the subtext. When Fred would call Ethel a feather-brained blonde or make a crack about her appetite, Frawley would put a little extra stinger on the end of the sentence. He wasn't just playing a character, he was taking a shot at the woman standing 3 feet away from him. Because Vance was so sensitive, her reactions were gold for the cameras. Her face would flush, her jaw would set, and that genuine spark of anger made for the kind of comedic timing you just can't teach in a classroom. The producers loved it. The more they fought, the higher the ratings climbed. It was a feedback loop from hell. Their misery was making them icons. This success created a strange codependent toxicity. Off-camera, they were still avoiding each other like the plague. There are stories from the set of them standing on opposite sides of a door, waiting to make an entrance, and not uttering a single syllable to each other until the director yelled, "Action!" The second the scene started, they were Fred and Ethel, the bickering but bonded landlords. The second it ended, they were 2 strangers who happened to share a paycheck. This toggle switch lifestyle started to wear on Vance's mental health. She began to feel that she couldn't escape Ethel or Frawley. She was becoming synonymous with a character she felt was beneath her, married to a man she found repulsive. Even the way they handled their fame was a point of contention. Frawley was a creature of habit. He'd go to his favorite bars or the Hollywood Park racetrack, and he loved it when fans recognized him as Fred. He'd give them a grumpy nod and a yeah, and go back to his drink. He embraced the caricature. Vance, however, struggled with it. She wanted to be recognized as an actress, as a singer, as a woman of talent. Instead, people would see her on the street and shout, "Hey Ethel, where's that old man of yours?" It was a constant reminder of the old man comment that started the war in the first place. Every fan interaction was a salt rub in the wound that Frawley had been nursing since day one. Lucille Ball, ever the savvy businesswoman, saw what was happening and tried to play mediator. But it was like trying to put out a forest fire with a squirt gun. Lucy was a perfectionist herself, but she was also intensely loyal to Frawley because he never upstaged her, and he always hit his marks. She would occasionally pull Vivian aside and tell her to just ignore him, which is easy to say when you're the star of the show and the boss's wife. But for Vance, ignoring Frawley was like ignoring a toothache. He was always there, lurking in the wings, ready with a snide remark about her weight, or a sarcastic comment about how many takes she needed to get a scene right. As the years rolled on, the lines between the actors and the characters blurred until they were almost non-existent. The insults in the scripts started to mirror the insults they traded in the hallways. When Fred complained about Ethel's cooking or her spending habits, it felt personal because, in Frawley's mind, it was personal. He viewed her as a pampered New York actress who didn't understand the real business of entertainment. He treated her like a nuisance, and she treated him like a relic. They were locked in a dance of mutual contempt that somehow, miraculously, looked like the most authentic marriage on television. The Cold War in the dressing rooms was about to turn into an all-out battle for territory, as the supporting stars began to realize that their perfect TV partnership was actually a professional prison. Dirty tricks and cold shoulders. If you think the bickering on screen was sharp, you should have seen what was happening when the cameras weren't rolling. By the middle of the show's run, the Mertz War had moved beyond mere insults and into the realm of psychological gamesmanship. The soundstage became a divided territory, like a comedy version of the Berlin Wall. Vivian Vance and William Frawley weren't just ignoring each other, they were actively trying to throw each other off their game. Frawley, with his vaudeville background, was a master of the unspoken jab. He knew that Vance was high-strung and obsessed with getting every beat perfect, so he would intentionally go rogue during rehearsals. He'd mumble his lines, look at his watch, or stare off into space while she was pouring her heart into a dramatic setup. It was his way of saying, "You're not that important, kid." Vance, for her part, wasn't just a passive victim. She was a brilliant comedic actress who knew exactly how to use her screen time to sideline Frawley. She would intentionally position herself so that she was the one taking the light, or she'd add a little extra bit of physical business, fixing her hair, adjusting a prop, right when Frawley was supposed to deliver a punchline. In the world of multi-camera sitcoms, these tiny moves are like professional stabs in the dark. They were constantly fighting for the audience's eye, and because they actually disliked each other, that competitive energy was electric. It made for great TV, but it made for a miserable Tuesday afternoon for everyone else on the crew. The person stuck in the middle of this radioactive mess was, of course, Lucille Ball. Lucy was a legendary perfectionist. Some might even say a taskmaster, and she had zero patience for anything that got in the way of the funny. She loved Vivian. They were genuine best friends who shared a rare comedic shorthand. But Lucy also had a strange, protective soft spot for Old Man Frawley. She respected his veteran status and the fact that he never, ever complained about the long hours or the grueling physical stunts. When Vivian would come to Lucy's dressing room in tears because Bill had called her a wide-bottomed amateur, or mocked her singing voice, Lucy would often give her a pat on the back and tell her to suck it up for the sake of the show. It wasn't that Lucy didn't care. It was that she knew Frawley was never going to change. He was a 70-year-old vaudevillian who viewed kindness as a sign of weakness. Desi Arnaz, the ultimate diplomat, tried a different tactic. He'd take Frawley out for drinks or to the track, trying to grease the wheels of his ego so he'd play nice with Vivian. It rarely worked for long. Frawley's resentment toward Vance was baked into his bones by that point. He felt she was ungrateful for the massive success the show had brought her. In his mind, she was a lucky broad who happened to land a role next to a pro like him. Meanwhile, Vance felt like she was trapped in a professional marriage with a bully who went out of his way to trigger her anxieties. There's a famous story of a cast party where Frawley reportedly walked up to Vance, looked at her drink, and made a cutting remark about how at least one of us is staying sober. A direct dig at her nerves and his own sobriety clause reputation. The sabotage even extended to the scripts. Both actors would frequently lobby the writers for better lines or more wins over the other character. If Fred got a particularly good zinger in on Ethel, Vivian would spend the rest of the week campaigning for a scene where she got to make him look foolish. This kept the writers in a constant state of anxiety, trying to balance the scales of a fictional marriage that was being fueled by a very real hatred. The irony is that this fairness in the scripts is exactly what made Fred and Ethel feel like a real couple. They gave as good as they got, and that balance was only there because the actors were literally fighting for every inch of territory on the page. By the time the show transitioned into the Lucy Desi Comedy Hour specials, the situation was untenable. They were no longer just co-workers. They were combatants who happened to be wearing costumes. The atmosphere on set was so thick with tension that guest stars would often comment on how uncomfortable it was to be around the Mertzes when the cameras stopped. They were two people who had spent nearly a decade making the world laugh together. Yet they couldn't stand to be in the same zip code as one another once the workday ended. The ultimate test of their mutual loathing wasn't what happened on the I Love Lucy set. It was what happened when a suitcase full of money was put on the table for them to stay together. The divorce that cost a fortune. By the late 50s, I Love Lucy wasn't just a sitcom, it was a cultural vacuum that sucked up every bit of attention in the American household. Desi Arnaz, the brilliant businessman behind the curtain, knew a cash cow when he saw one. He looked at the ratings and saw that Fred and Ethel were often just as popular as Lucy and Ricky. The Mertzes had become shorthand for the quintessential bickering American couple. So Desi did what any savvy mogul would do. He walked into a room with a briefcase metaphorically bursting with cash and offered William Frawley and Vivian Vance their very own spin-off series. The proposed show, aptly titled The Mertzes, was a guaranteed hit. In an era where $50,000 was a king's ransom, enough to buy several luxury homes, that was the salary being floated for them to simply keep doing what they were already doing. For William Frawley, this was the ultimate retirement plan. He was in his 70s, his health was beginning to show the wear and tear of a life lived in smoky bars and drafty theaters, and he knew his days as a leading man, even a grumpy one, were numbered. To Bill, the offer was a no-brainer. He didn't care that he hated Vivian, he cared about the racetrack, his bank account, and his legacy as a working actor. He was a product of the Depression, a man who viewed turning down a paycheck as a mortal sin. He waited by the phone, probably with a cigar in one hand and a racing form in the other, fully expecting his wife to sign on the dotted line so they could ride their mutual loathing all the way to the bank. But he underestimated the depth of Vivian Vance's misery. To Vivian, the end of I Love Lucy wasn't just the conclusion of a job, it was a parole date. She had spent nearly a decade being Ethel, the frumpy, insulted, overlooked sidekick to a man who took active pleasure in her insecurities. When Desi presented her with the spin-off offer, she didn't even hesitate. She turned it down flat. She reportedly told Desi that she wouldn't work with that man again if he paved the streets with gold. For Vance, no amount of money was worth the psychological toll of another season of Frawley's snide remarks and Broadway girl jabs. She wanted her life back. When the news reached Frawley that the spin-off was dead because Vivian refused to play ball, his resentment turned into a cold, hard fury. To him, she hadn't just insulted his acting, she had reached into his pocket and stolen his future. He viewed her rejection as the ultimate act of theatrical arrogance. In his mind, she was a mid-level actress who owed her entire career to the show and, by extension, to him, and now she was acting like she was too good for the very thing that made her famous. He never forgave her for that theatrical harm. From that moment on, he didn't just dislike her, he despised her with a professional intensity that lasted until the day he died. He made sure everyone in Hollywood knew that the girl had ruined a perfectly good meal ticket for both of them. The fallout was immediate. The professional divorce was final, and the two actors went their separate ways with a sense of profound relief on one side and bitter abandonment on the other. Vivian moved on to The Lucy Show, but she made it a contractual requirement that she wouldn't be frumpy anymore. She played Vivian Bagley, a character who was allowed to be stylish and independent, a clear middle finger to the years she spent in Ethel's housecoats. Frawley eventually landed a role on My Three Sons, playing Bub, another version of the grumpy but lovable grandfather type. But the spark was different. He was working with men and boys now, away from the prima donna he blamed for his lost spin-off. Yet he never quite shook the ghost of the Mertz era. Even years later, when reporters would ask them about a potential reunion, the answers were telling. Frawley would usually grunt something derogatory about that woman, while Vance would simply go cold, refusing to even acknowledge his name. They had created something immortal together, a portrait of marriage that millions of people saw as the gold standard of real love. But the foundation of that portrait was built on a pile of broken glass. The $50,000 rejection remains one of the great what-ifs of television history. A moment where personal peace finally triumphed over professional greed. As the curtain finally began to fall on their storied careers, the two actors would find themselves living very different lives, yet they remained forever tethered by a legacy of laughter that neither of them could truly escape. Separate curtains and cold eulogies. As the 60s rolled in, the neon lights of the I Love Lucy era began to dim, leaving Vivian Vance and William Frawley to navigate a Hollywood that was rapidly changing. For Vivian, the end of the Mertzes was like waking up from a decade-long fever dream. She moved to Connecticut, married her fourth husband, John Dodds, and finally found the personal stability that had eluded her during the high-pressure years of the 50s. She didn't stay away from the cameras for long, though. Lucille Ball, ever the loyal friend, lured her back for The Lucy Show. But this time, the terms were different. Vivian put her foot down. She would play Vivian Bagley, a character who was allowed to be chic, wore stylish clothes, and most importantly, did not have a husband to bicker with. It was a professional rebranding that allowed her to finally shed the dowdy skin of Ethel Mertz. William Frawley, meanwhile, found himself a new home on the hit series My Three Sons. Playing Bub O'Casey, he was essentially playing a version of Fred Mertz, if Fred had moved to the suburbs and traded his landlord duties for grandfatherly advice. It was a comfortable gig, and Frawley was beloved by the young cast members who saw him as a crusty but kind grandfather figure. Yet, the bitterness over the failed Mertz spin-off never truly left him. He was a man who lived in the past, often seen sitting at his favorite table at Musso and Frank Grill, nursing a drink and grumbling about the Broadway amateur who had cost him his own show. He was a creature of habit until the very end, a relic of a vaudeville era that was disappearing into the history books. The two former co-stars lived in the same city, moved in the same professional circles, and shared the same legendary status, yet they remained as polarized as two magnets. They never had a reconciling lunch. There were no tearful phone calls to bury the hatchet. They simply existed in a state of mutual icy avoidance. When Frawley's health began to fail in the mid-60s due to a heart condition, he didn't reach out to his TV wife, and she certainly didn't send flowers. Their professional marriage had been a contract, and once that contract was shredded, there was nothing left but the scar tissue of 1,000 small insults. The end for William Frawley came abruptly on March 3, 1966. He was walking down Hollywood Boulevard after seeing a movie when he collapsed from a massive heart attack. He died on the sidewalk, just a few blocks away from the Walk of Fame where his star is cemented. It was a quintessentially Hollywood death for a man who had spent his entire life in the industry. The news rippled through the entertainment world, and reporters immediately scrambled to get a quote from the woman who had spent 9 years by his side. The story of Vivian Vance's reaction has become the stuff of show business legend, and it perfectly encapsulates the depth of their feud. Vivian was reportedly dining at a restaurant with her husband when the news reached her. According to witnesses, she didn't cry. She didn't offer a platitude about his talent or his tough-as-nails exterior. Instead, she allegedly sighed and said, "Champagne for everyone." It was a moment of shocking, unfiltered honesty. To Vivian, Frawley wasn't a beloved icon. He was the man who had bullied her, mocked her insecurities, and made her feel small for nearly a decade. His passing wasn't a tragedy to her. It was the final, definitive end to a chapter of her life she had never wanted to write. Vivian herself would continue to work sporadically, making guest appearances and staying close to Lucille Ball until her own health began to decline. She battled breast cancer and suffered a stroke, eventually passing away in 1979 at the age of 70. In her final years, she spoke about the I Love Lucy days with a mix of pride and pain. She knew she had helped create something that would live forever, but she also knew the cost. She once remarked that people would always love Ethel, but they never really knew Vivian, and she seemed okay with that, as long as she never had to be Mrs. Mertz again. They were the ultimate professionals. They hated each other with a passion, but they loved the funny just a little bit more. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit the subscribe button and click on the next video on the screen for your next binge.